The wind moved softly through the canyon that night, brushing the dry grass and whispering through the scattered rocks. It was a quiet night, the kind that usually made Samuel feel safe. He had spent most of his life riding these trails between ranches. The stars above were like a roof of light, and the moon gave the path a soft silver glow. He had made this ride 100 times before, but that night felt different. The air was colder than usual. The silence seemed too heavy, like the desert was holding its breath. Samuel was 25, strong from years of working the land. His hands were rough from roping cattle and fixing fences. He wore a faded hat that once belonged to his father, and a thick wool coat to fight off the chill. His horse Dusty moved carefully over the rocky ground. Samuel patted the animal's neck, talking to him in a soft voice to calm them both. "Almost home, boy," he whispered. "Almost there." He didn't know that danger waited just beyond the bend. Someone else was in the canyon that night. Someone with a rifle and sharp eyes. Samuel couldn't see the shadow crouched among the rocks, but the shadow saw him. One moment he was enjoying the ride. The next, the night exploded with a sound that cut through the still air. A single shot. The bullet struck his shoulder with a force he couldn't have imagined. It felt like being hit by a hammer made of fire. Samuel gasped and nearly fell off the saddle, clutching at the wound. His hand came away warm and wet. Blood. The pain burned through him, sharp and deep, and his vision started to blur. Dusty reared up, startled by the noise, and Samuel couldn't hold on. He fell hard to the cold ground. The impact knocked the breath out of him. His back hit the dirt and small stones dug into his skin. Dusty bolted down the path, hooves echoing into the night, leaving Samuel alone. He tried to call out, but his voice was weak and broken. He pressed his hand to his shoulder, feeling the warm blood soaking through his coat and shirt. The pain was spreading down his arm, heavy and hot, and he could already feel his strength slipping away. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade. The stars above looked dim. The wind that had once felt calm now bit into him like ice. Samuel blinked hard, trying to stay awake. He rolled to his side and tried to push himself up, but the pain sent him crashing back down. His breath came in shallow gasps. He had always thought of death as something far away, something that happened to other men. But lying there, bleeding into the cold earth, it no longer felt distant. It felt close. Too close. His mind jumped from one memory to another. His mother singing by the fire when he was little. His father teaching him to ride Dusty for the first time. The summer storms that used to make him laugh when he was young. All those memories seemed to flash like a lantern flickering in the dark. And then a thought came to him, quiet and strange. This is how it ends. Not with noise, not with someone beside him, but here, alone in the canyon with the stars watching. He could taste iron on his lips. His breath was getting slower. The cold was crawling in under his coat, pulling the warmth out of him. He had always believed he was strong enough to survive anything. Ranch life taught him to be tough, to fight through storms, broken bones, and hard winters. But this was different. This was death whispering in the darkness. A single coyote howled in the distance. Samuel stared at the sky, his heartbeat pounding against his wound. The pain came in waves, and between each wave there was a strange calm, like the world was gently closing its hands around him. He didn't know who shot him. Maybe it was a thief. Maybe it was someone he'd never meet. It didn't matter now. All that mattered was the fight to breathe. He whispered a few words to no one. "Please, not yet." His voice was so soft even the wind could have carried it away. His eyelids grew heavy. The night wrapped around him like a thick blanket, dark and quiet. He tried to stay awake by focusing on the stars, but the stars were spinning. He felt warm blood running down his side, soaking into the ground. He thought about home, about how close it was. Just a few more miles. He could have been safe. But safety was too far now. His fingers twitched against the dirt, weak and useless. His heartbeat was slower, each thump louder in his ears than the last. He thought of the men he'd known who died on the frontier. Some from fever, some from falls, some from gunfire like this. They always said it happened fast. They were wrong. It was slow, so slow that you had time to remember everything, and still feel the world slipping away. The canyon around him grew quieter, as if even the night animals were holding still. A cold breeze brushed against his face, carrying the faint smell of sage and dust. He shivered, but his body didn't respond the way it should. His legs felt far away, like they didn't belong to him anymore. His hand slipped from his shoulder, too tired to hold the wound closed any longer. A thin trickle of blood spread over the ground like dark ink on paper. Samuel thought about praying. He hadn't done it in years. But in moments like these, a man doesn't have much left to hold on to. His lips moved silently. He wasn't asking for a miracle. He was just asking to be remembered. He didn't want to vanish into the dark like another nameless man on the frontier. The stars blurred into one bright white haze. His vision tunneled until he could see nothing but the silver moon. His heartbeat was faint, like a drum too far away to hear clearly. So this is it, he thought. He had always imagined death would come with noise, screaming, thunder, or the roar of a storm. But it came quietly, softly, like a hand on his shoulder. He closed his eyes, letting go of the world piece by piece. The night wrapped him in silence. The last sound he heard was the faint rustling of dry grass and the echo of his horse's hooves fading into the distance. His breathing was shallow. He felt the darkness press against him like water pulling him under. Then something strange happened. A faint crunch in the dirt nearby. A shadow moved along the edge of the canyon wall. Samuel was too weak to lift his head, but some part of him still felt it. A presence. Not the wind, not the night, but someone else. He didn't know who. It didn't matter. His mind was floating in a fog. He thought maybe death was coming for him, quiet and patient just like this. His lips parted slightly. He wanted to speak, but no words came out. The world dimmed further. His fingers curled loosely in the dirt as if holding on to the land itself. He wasn't ready to die, but the choice wasn't his anymore. The stars above flickered like dying candles. His heartbeat was a soft echo, fading with each second. He whispered one last breath, not sure if anyone could hear it. Please. And then everything went still. The wind stopped. The canyon held its breath. And Samuel, lying alone in the dark with blood soaking into the earth, thought death had come for him first. But somewhere beyond his blurred vision, soft footsteps moved closer through the night. Quiet, careful, steady. Someone was there. Someone had found him. Aylin had walked this land since she was a child. The canyons and deserts were not empty to her. They were alive, full of quiet voices that most people never heard. She could feel a storm coming by the way the wind moved. She could tell if someone had passed through the valley by the way a single branch bent. That night the silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy kind, the kind that made her stop and listen. She had been gathering dry wood near the canyon ridge when she heard it. A single sharp crack. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a branch snapping. It was the sound of a rifle echoing across the rocks. Her heart tightened. Out here, a gunshot at night almost never meant something good. She lifted her head, listening carefully as the sound faded into the darkness. Then she felt it, a strange pull in her chest, the kind that told her someone needed help. She didn't think twice. She picked up her small leather pouch, tied it to her belt, and moved down the narrow path toward the sound. Aylin walked softly, her moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. She had learned long ago how to move like the wind, present but unseen. The moonlight painted the rocks silver and the shadows black. She let her eyes adjust slowly. This land was her teacher, and she trusted it more than she trusted her own thoughts. As she moved deeper into the canyon, she saw something that didn't belong. The faint prints of a horse's hooves fresh in the dirt. Next to them, darker marks, blood. Her breath caught for just a second. She knelt down, touching the ground lightly with her fingers. The blood was still warm. Someone was hurt. She followed the trail carefully. Her heart beat steady even as the air grew colder. She had seen wounded men before, and she knew how fast a night like this could steal their lives away. The trail curved between two large boulders and opened into a wide, flat patch of ground. That's where she saw him. A young man lay crumpled near the rocks, his hat tilted to the side, his coat soaked dark around his shoulder. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted like he had been whispering to the night. A pool of blood had formed beneath him, slowly seeping into the dirt. His horse was nowhere in sight. Aylin stopped for a moment, looking at him carefully. She didn't know who he was. His clothes marked him as a settler, someone from the ranch lands, not from her people. She could have turned away. It wasn't her fight. But she was not the kind of woman who walked away from someone standing at the edge of death. Her grandmother had once told her, "When a life falls into your hands, the spirits are watching. What you do next becomes part of you forever." She stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a wild animal that might run. But the man didn't move. She lowered herself to the ground and pressed two fingers gently against his neck. There it was, a weak but steady heartbeat. He was still alive, though the warmth was leaving him fast. His breaths came short and uneven, like someone running a race in their sleep. Aylin didn't hesitate anymore. She opened her small pouch and took out a bundle of dried herbs wrapped in soft deer hide. These herbs had been gathered in summer, dried under the sun and kept for moments like this. She also pulled out a small leather water flask and a strip of clean cloth. She carefully pulled his coat open to see the wound. The bullet had torn through his shoulder just below the collarbone. The bleeding hadn't stopped. If it continued like this, he wouldn't last the night. She pressed her hand against the wound to slow it, feeling the hot blood against her palm. She could hear his heartbeat in the silence. She whispered softly in her language, not spells, just steady words to keep herself calm. Hold on, do not leave yet." Samuel stirred slightly. He wasn't fully awake, but somewhere deep inside he must have felt her presence. His lips moved, but no words came out. His eyes opened just a sliver, catching the light of the moon. For a heartbeat their eyes met, his filled with confusion and pain, hers with quiet determination. He saw a stranger, an Apache woman, leaning over him, but there was no fear in her face, only focus. She reached for her water flask and wet the cloth. She wiped the blood away gently so she could see the wound clearly. Her hands moved with practiced care. She had helped her people in hunts, in accidents, and sometimes after fights. She had watched her grandmother heal wounds that most people would have given up on. But this man was not one of her people. She knew what it could mean if someone found her with him. Yet she also knew she couldn't let him die here. She leaned close, listening to his breathing. Weak. Fading. The cold was already creeping into his skin. She needed to keep him warm. She pulled her shawl from her shoulders and wrapped it around his chest, tucking it beneath him to keep the heat in. The desert nights could be cruel. She had seen strong men survive the wound only to die from the cold. She gathered some dried sagebrush and a few sticks from the ground nearby. With quick movements, she built a small fire close enough to warm him, but not close enough to make smoke rise too high. She struck a spark with flint, and soon a soft flame flickered between the rocks. The orange light touched his face, making him look less like a ghost and more like a man. Aylin returned to the wound. She needed to stop the bleeding. She pressed her fingers around it, searching carefully to see how deep it was. She whispered again, her words calm like water over stones. She reached for the herbs and crushed them between her palms, mixing them with a little water. The smell filled the air, sharp, earthy, alive. She worked quickly. She cleaned around the wound as gently as she could, whispering to keep his spirit anchored. She pressed the mixture against the torn flesh to draw out the blood and help it clot. The warmth of his blood was still strong, but it was draining fast. If she didn't act fast, the night would claim him. Samuel groaned softly, the sound of someone trapped between sleep and pain. His eyes fluttered again, confused and glassy. He didn't have the strength to speak, but he felt hands on him. Warm, careful hands. Not death, not cold. He wasn't alone anymore, though he didn't understand why. Aylin leaned closer, speaking softly near his ear, even though she knew he might not understand the words. "Do not let go. Not tonight. You will stay." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't panic. She had learned that the best way to fight death was to be steady, not loud. She ripped another piece of cloth from the inside of her skirt to make a clean bandage. With firm but gentle hands, she wrapped it around his shoulder to hold the herbs in place and stop the blood from spilling anymore. When she tied the knot, her fingers brushed against his skin, already cold from shock. She knew he had a hard fight ahead. She sat back for a moment, breathing slowly. The night wind brushed against her cheeks. Somewhere far away, an owl called. She looked at the young man lying in front of her. He was someone from another world, a world that did not always welcome hers. But right now he was just a man trying to live. She leaned over again, feeling for the pulse in his neck. It was still there, but weak. She needed to keep him awake. She gently tapped his cheek, whispering, "Stay with me." His eyelids flickered but didn't open fully. She took a small sip of water and pressed the damp cloth to his lips. A drop slid down his throat, and for a second, he made a small sound, a sign of life. Aylin's thoughts flashed briefly to the stories told around the fire, stories of those who passed alone in the desert because no one came. She wouldn't let that happen to him. Not tonight. She shifted his body slightly so he wouldn't drown in his own blood if he slipped deeper into unconsciousness. She glanced up at the ridge. Whoever fired that shot could still be nearby. But the land was quiet now. The only sound was the crackle of the small fire and the uneven rhythm of his breathing. She took out another small pouch, a special powder made from plants only gathered by healers. She sprinkled a little on the bandage to help stop infection. Then she sat closer, resting one hand lightly against his chest to feel the rise and fall. Each breath meant he was still fighting. Hours passed like this. She didn't move far. She kept watch like a silent guardian, adjusting the bandage when it loosened, adding wood to the fire when the cold grew stronger. Every so often she whispered something soft into the night. Not a prayer, not a spell, but words meant to keep hope alive. The stars wheeled slowly above the canyon. The night was deep and quiet, but she didn't feel alone. She felt the weight of a choice she had made, to stand between him and the darkness. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story. But she knew she had found him for a reason. When the wind grew colder, she moved closer, covering his chest with more of her shawl. She checked the pulse again. Still there. Fragile but alive. Her eyes stayed sharp, her hand steady. Even as her own body grew tired, she wasn't leaving him. Not tonight. Far away, Dusty's distant hooves had already vanished into the night, but here in this small circle of firelight, something unexpected was happening. A man who thought death had come first had been found, and an Apache woman, alone in the canyon, had made a silent promise. He would not face that darkness alone. Samuel floated in a place between dreams and pain. Everything around him felt distant, like a memory that wouldn't stay still. He could hear faint sounds, but they were blurry, like voices echoing from the other end of a long tunnel. Sometimes he felt warmth on his skin. Other times he felt nothing at all. His thoughts came and went like drifting smoke, never staying long enough for him to hold them. His body hurt. The pain was sharp, heavy, and warm at the same time. It sat deep in his shoulder, spreading like fire. Every breath made the wound throb. It wasn't just pain. It was the feeling of his strength leaving him bit by bit. Somewhere in his mind, he still believed death had already reached for him, but something gentle kept pulling him back. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was soft, warm, steady. Aylin knelt beside him with the same quiet focus she had learned since she was a child. The fire she built glowed softly, lighting the rocks with a warm orange light. It wasn't a large fire. She kept it small on purpose so no one passing from afar could spot it easily. Her hands moved carefully, steady as the earth itself. She checked the bandage she had wrapped around his shoulder. The bleeding had slowed, but it hadn't fully stopped. The herbs she had used were doing their work, but now came the part where patience mattered most. She leaned closer, listening to the sound of his breathing. It was uneven but present. That was enough. She didn't know his name, but she spoke to him anyway in her soft voice, as if speaking could build a bridge to keep him here. Stay with the living. The night is long, but it will pass. Samuel's head turned just a little. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, seeing nothing but firelight and a blurred face. He couldn't make sense of who she was. He saw dark hair braided back, strong cheekbones, calm eyes. She wasn't death. She was real. Her face wasn't cold, it was warm like the fire. The world slipped again. He fell into a soft darkness. In that darkness, he saw his father's face, heard his voice telling him how to ride a horse. He saw his mother in the kitchen with flour on her hands. He smelled the wheat fields in summer. But those weren't real. They were the world that was fading from him. Then a hand touched his forehead, cool and gentle, and pulled him back to where he really was. On the ground, beside a fire under a silver moon. Aylin took a clean cloth and dipped it into her flask of water. She placed it on his forehead to cool his rising fever. She could feel the heat growing inside him. Fever was a dangerous enemy. A wound might heal, but a fever could steal someone away silently in the night. She pressed the cloth gently, watching for signs in his face. His breathing quickened, his brow tensed. She knew his body was fighting. The wound needed to be cleaned again. She spoke to him even though she knew he couldn't fully understand. "I'm going to help you. It will hurt, but stay." She unwrapped part of the bandage, revealing the injury in the soft firelight. The blood had slowed to a dark, sticky line. She carefully pressed fresh herbs into the wound. These weren't ordinary plants. They were ones gathered after the first spring rain, chosen for their power to draw out infection. She mixed them with water from her flask and held them in place with clean cloth. Samuel groaned softly. He felt a strange pressure on his shoulder, like hands reaching inside the pain. For a moment he wanted to move to push the feeling away, but his body was too weak. The warmth from the fire, the gentle hands, and the low sound of her voice kept him still. Aylin pressed her lips briefly to the wound, not out of affection, but to clear the blood and keep the herbs pressed in tightly. Her people believed the healer had to give a piece of their breath to the wounded, so their strength could stay. She exhaled slowly, steadying her hands. She could taste the metallic salt of blood, feel the heat of his skin, and sense how close the balance was. He was walking on a line between life and death. She tightened the bandage again, pulling it just enough to keep the herbs in place, but not so tight that it would choke off blood flow. Then she sat back and stared at him for a long moment. His face was pale in the flickering light, but there was something stubborn in the way his jaw tensed. She recognized that stubbornness. It was the same thing she had seen in warriors who refused to fall. The fire cracked softly, sending a warm light across the rocks. The wind brushed against her cheek, carrying the scent of sage. The desert at night was quiet in a way that most people didn't understand. It wasn't silence. It was full of tiny sounds, wind, insects, distant cries of animals. It was a living silence, one that listened as much as it spoke. Aylin whispered to the stars as she worked. Not prayers exactly, but words she had learned from her grandmother when she was small. Words meant to hold someone to the earth. "The night is strong," she whispered. "But so are you. Breathe, just breathe." Samuel's chest rose and fell, slow and unsteady. His mind wandered through strange dreams. In one moment he saw his home bathed in sunlight. In another he saw a wide river he didn't recognize. Faces came and went. Then through the darkness a soft voice reached him. He couldn't understand the language, but the voice was like warm hands guiding him through a storm. His eyes opened again, a little wider this time. He saw the fire. He saw her kneeling beside him. He saw her hands on the wound, her face steady, calm and determined. She wasn't death. She wasn't the enemy. She was fighting to keep him here. He tried to speak. His voice came out cracked, barely a whisper. "Why?" The single word hung weak in the cold air. Aylin understood the question even if the words were faint. She didn't answer in his language. She only placed her hand gently against his chest and pressed lightly as if to say, "Stay still." Her eyes said what words couldn't, "Because you are alive and life is worth saving." The night deepened. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the uneven sound of his breathing. Aylin didn't move far from his side. She kept the fire fed with small twigs so it wouldn't die. She checked the bandage again and again. She whispered when his breathing grew weaker. Not because she thought he could hear every word, but because she believed a voice could help keep someone anchored to the world. At one point, his hand twitched slightly against the ground. Aylin saw it and placed her hand over his. Not tight, not soft, just enough to remind him that he wasn't alone in the canyon. His fingers trembled faintly before going still again. The fever came in waves. His body shook with chills, then burned with heat. Aylin moved with him through each wave, wiping his forehead with cool water, whispering soft words, adjusting the bandage. She was tired, but she didn't show it. Her grandmother had always said a healer had to give their calm to the one who was breaking. In his half-conscious state, Samuel felt moments of clarity. He realized he wasn't lying alone anymore. Someone was fighting for him. He could feel her presence like a light on the other side of a fog. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but somehow it mattered. The world didn't feel as cold when he felt her near. The stars above began to shift as the night moved on. The moon, once high and bright, was slowly lowering toward the western horizon. The fire burned low, but Aylin added more wood, keeping it steady. She could feel his pulse growing a little stronger beneath her fingertips. Not much, but enough to tell her he was still in the fight. She leaned close again, whispering near his ear. "The night has not taken you yet. Stay with me." Her voice was soft but strong, like roots buried deep in the ground. Samuel opened his eyes just enough to see her shadow outlined against the fire. He didn't have the strength to speak again, but in his mind something shifted. He no longer thought death was waiting at his shoulder. He started to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone was pulling him back. The firelight flickered over their faces, painting the canyon walls with gold. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled again. The night was still long, but he was breathing. She was still there. And between the two of them, in that quiet space, a fragile thread of life held fast against the darkness. The night grew long, stretching into the kind of silence that made time feel endless. The moon had crossed high above the canyon, and the stars shimmered like cold fire in the black sky. The air was sharp and thin, carrying the scent of sage, dust, and smoke from the small fire Aylin had built. Every few minutes the fire popped softly as a stick burned through. Aylin sat close to the injured man, her body still, her mind alert, like a hunter watching over something precious. She hadn't closed her eyes once. Her people had always said that when a person hovers between life and death, you must not leave them alone. The night could be greedy. It could pull a soul away the moment no one was looking. Aylin had no plans to let that happen. She watched the rise and fall of his chest like a quiet rhythm, steadying her own breathing with it. Samuel was still trapped in a place between dreams and waking. The pain in his shoulder came and went like waves. He felt the cold of the night on his face, then the warmth of the fire, then nothing at all. Sometimes he thought he was back home on the ranch, hearing his mother call him in for supper. Sometimes he thought he was floating above the earth, weightless and far away. But no matter how far his mind drifted, something pulled him back. A quiet voice, a soft touch, a warmth that did not let go. Aylin leaned closer to check his forehead. The fever had risen and fallen throughout the night, but now it seemed to settle. She placed a cool cloth against his skin. His body trembled for a moment, then relaxed. That was a good sign. She had seen men lose the fight long before dawn. This one was still holding on. She glanced at the wound again. The herbs were holding. The bleeding had stopped, though the edges of the bandage were dark with dried blood. She carefully removed the outer cloth and checked the mixture beneath. The herbs had soaked in well. The wound no longer poured life away, but it wasn't safe yet. Infection could still steal everything if she didn't keep it clean. She pressed a new mix of crushed leaves and clean cloth against the wound, working with quiet patience. Her movements were steady, almost like a slow dance between her hands and the night. She whispered as she worked, words her grandmother had passed down through many winters. Stay with the earth. Breathe with it. Do not let go yet. Samuel's body reacted faintly to her touch. His breathing grew rough for a moment, then steadied again. His eyelids fluttered. He was close to waking fully this time. Aylin moved closer, not wanting his first sight to be darkness and fear. She had learned that waking after a night like this could be confusing, even dangerous. His lips parted. A soft sound escaped, more like a breath than a word. His fingers twitched weakly at his side. Then slowly, painfully, his eyes opened. At first, the world was a blur. All he could see were shapes and shadows. The firelight danced in his vision. His head pounded like a hammer. His mouth was dry, his throat rough. He blinked several times before the shapes began to sharpen. There she was, the woman. The one who had leaned over him in the darkness. The one who had stayed. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, and the firelight touched the edges of her dark hair like gold. Samuel tried to speak, but his voice cracked like dry wood. Where am I? Aylin didn't speak English well, but she understood enough. She pointed gently to the ground and spoke slowly, her voice quiet and smooth. Canyon, you hurt. I help. The words reached him like warm water on cold skin. He stared at her, confused, breathing in quick, uneven gasps. His memory returned in broken pieces. The gunshot, the fall, the cold earth, the feeling of death creeping closer. And then her face, her hands, her voice. She had been there the whole time. He coughed softly, pain flashing through his shoulder. She reached out and pressed her hand gently against his chest to keep him from trying to sit up. No. Rest, she said, her accent heavy but clear enough to understand. He let his head fall back against the makeshift pillow she had made from her shawl. His eyes searched her face. She was not a vision. She was real, sitting beside him with tired eyes that had not closed all night. He whispered, You saved me. Aylin didn't answer that. She didn't save people for thanks. She simply tilted her head and studied him like someone studying a wild bird caught in a storm. You live, she said simply. That is enough. The wind moved softly through the canyon again, lifting strands of her hair. She adjusted the shawl around his chest to keep him warm, then handed him the small flask she carried. Drink, she said, raising it gently to his lips. The water was cool and tasted like life itself. Samuel drank slowly, each swallow clearing some of the fog from his mind. His hand trembled when he tried to hold the flask, so she steadied it for him. After a few small sips, she lowered it again. He lay quietly for a moment, listening to the fire crackle and the distant howl of a night animal. The stars above seemed so much brighter now that he was awake. For the first time since he fell, he felt truly alive. And he knew, without her, he would not have been. He looked at her again. She sat cross-legged beside the fire, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her face calm and unreadable. He noticed the small pouches at her waist, the herbs, the careful way she moved. She wasn't just a woman passing through. She was someone who knew the land, someone who knew how to keep a dying man alive through the night. "Why?" he whispered. "Why help me?" Aylin turned her eyes toward the sky for a brief moment before looking back at him. She searched for the right words in English. "Because life is life," she said finally. "Not yours, not mine. Just life." Samuel stared at her, not sure what to say. In all his years on the ranch, in all the stories he'd heard about the Apache, no one had told him a story like this. They told stories of fear, of danger. But this woman, she was none of that. She had chosen to help a stranger she could have left behind. The wind grew colder as the night stretched on. Aylin stood and added a few more sticks to the fire. Her shadow grew long against the rocks. Samuel watched her move, graceful and silent, like she belonged to the canyon itself. When she returned to his side, she checked the bandage again, pressing lightly around the edges to make sure the herbs stayed where they needed to be. Samuel winced but didn't pull away. Her hands were warm against his skin, and for the first time since the gunshot he felt a thin thread of hope. "Pain?" she asked, pointing at his shoulder. He nodded weakly. "Yes." She took a small pinch of a different herb from her pouch, mixed it with a few drops of water and brought it to his lips. "Bitter," she warned softly. He trusted her. He drank it. The taste was sharp and earthy, but it left a strange warmth spreading through his chest. She explained slowly, "Helps. Sleep, not die." Her words made him laugh softly, though it hurt. It wasn't a loud laugh, just a quiet sound, surprised and tired. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the smoke of the fire and the scent of her herbs. His heartbeat, once weak and distant, felt stronger now. Aylin settled back down beside him, but she didn't close her eyes. She kept her ears open to the night, listening for footsteps, for danger, for anything that might come through the canyon, but nothing came. Only the wind and the steady crackling of fire. Samuel turned his head slightly toward her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. She looked at him for a moment, then said quietly, "Aylin." He repeated it softly, letting the sound settle on his tongue. "Aylin." She gave a small nod. "And you?" "Samuel," he whispered. The night held their names like a secret between them. Two strangers from different worlds, thrown together by chance, sitting beside a small fire in a quiet canyon. The fever had eased. The bleeding had slowed. The cold had been pushed back by her shawl and the fire. Samuel wasn't safe yet, but the darkness no longer pressed down on him like a heavy hand. The worst part of the night had passed, and the edge between life and death was growing wider. Aylin pulled her blanket tighter around his body, her movements slow and careful. She sat close enough to feel his breathing without touching him. She watched the stars turn and fade as the night crept toward morning. Samuel's eyelids grew heavy again, but this time it wasn't the darkness pulling him down. It was a softer, safer sleep. His last thought before drifting off was of her voice, calm and steady, speaking words he didn't understand but felt deep in his chest. Aylin stayed awake, keeping watch. She had seen many long nights on the land, but this one felt different. This night would not be forgotten. And when the faint gray light of dawn began to stretch across the canyon, Samuel was still alive because she had stayed. The first soft light of morning touched the canyon like a quiet hand. The stars faded slowly, one by one, as the sky turned pale blue above the ridges. The cold that had wrapped the night began to loosen its grip, and the desert started to breathe again. A few birds cried from the distant rocks, and the wind carried the smell of sage and warm sand. Samuel's breathing was steady now, not like the fragile gasps of the night before. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers resting in the dust. Aylin sat cross-legged beside him, her hair pulled back, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes were tired but calm. She had not slept even a heartbeat through the night. She had stayed there watching his chest rise and fall, guarding the line between life and death until the sun came. When Samuel opened his eyes, the world was no longer spinning. The pain was still sharp in his shoulder, but it was no longer the kind that made him feel like he was falling into darkness. He blinked against the soft light, trying to piece together everything that had happened. He saw the ridges around him, the fading smoke of the fire, and her, still there, exactly where she had been. For a moment, he just watched her. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were on the horizon where the sun was slowly rising, her face calm like someone who belonged to the land itself. He realized she could have left hours ago. She could have walked away when the bleeding stopped. But she hadn't. She turned her head then, sensing that he was awake. Their eyes met in the soft morning light. She gave a small nod, not a smile exactly, but something quiet and steady like saying, "You made it." Samuel's throat was dry, his voice weak but clear enough. "I'm alive," he whispered. Aylin nodded again. "Yes, you live." Her words were simple, but to him they carried the weight of everything she had done in the night. He swallowed, trying to find the right words. "I thought I was going to die out here." "You almost," she answered softly, tilting her head. Her accent was still heavy, but her meaning was clear. He tried to sit up slowly, and she reached out without thinking, placing a steady hand on his uninjured arm to help him. Pain flared through his shoulder like a flash of fire, but it didn't knock him down this time. He clenched his teeth and managed to sit upright, leaning against a smooth rock. The world tilted for a second, then steadied. She lifted her flask and held it out to him again. "Drink," she said. He took it carefully, his hand still weak but steadier than it had been in the night. The water was warm now from sitting near the fire, but it tasted better than anything he could remember. Each swallow felt like it was filling some small empty place inside him. As he drank, his eyes wandered to the bandage on his shoulder. He could see the herbs pressed into the wound, wrapped tightly with clean cloth. It was no miracle. It was work, steady, patient, skillful work. She had done all of it. He lowered the flask and looked at her. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You stayed with me." Aylin didn't answer right away. She watched the sunlight stretch across the canyon floor, as if letting the morning speak first. Then she said, "A life is not something to throw away. The night wanted to take you. I did not let it." Her words sat deep in him, heavier than any promise. Samuel had grown up on stories told around campfires in dusty barns over late-night coffee. None of them sounded like this. No one had ever told him that a stranger would fight all night to keep him alive. He lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of something inside him shift. "Thank you," he said softly, but the words felt too small for what she had done. She tilted her head, almost like she didn't need thanks. She simply said, "You must heal now." The morning moved slowly, the sun climbing higher. Aylin stood and moved with quiet, smooth steps to gather some more herbs from a small pouch she kept tied to her belt. She crouched beside him again and began to unwrap the bandage carefully. Samuel winced, but she worked with gentle, practiced hands. The wound was still raw, but it was no longer bleeding. Her herbs had done their work through the night. She cleaned the wound again with fresh water from her flask, then packed it with a new mixture, the scent of crushed leaves filling the air. As she worked, Samuel couldn't help but watch her. Every movement she made was careful, measured with the kind of skill that came from years of knowing how to heal. She wasn't just someone who had happened to find him. She was someone who understood life and death in a way he didn't. "You do this a lot?" he asked quietly. Aylin nodded slightly. "Yes, for my people. For those who need." He thought about that for a long moment. Then he asked softly, "Why help me?" I'm not one of your people." She paused for a heartbeat, her hand still pressing the herbs into place. Then she met his eyes. "Pain is pain. Wound is wound. When the desert takes a man, it does not ask who he is. Why should I?" Her words sank into him like the first warm light after a storm. He had grown up thinking the world was split into lines. His people on one side, hers on the other. But last night, none of those lines had mattered. In the cold darkness, there had only been two people, one dying and one choosing to help. After she finished with the bandage, she sat back on her heels and studied him with quiet eyes. "You will walk soon," she said, "but not today. You rest." He nodded, too tired to argue. The sun had climbed high enough now to warm his face. The fire had burned down to ash. He could hear the sound of a river somewhere far off and the rustling of the wind in the canyon. Everything felt more alive than it had when he lay there waiting to die. Samuel leaned his head back against the rock, letting his gaze drift to the sky. "If you hadn't come," he whispered, "I'd be gone." Aylin didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him with a calm that came from someone who had seen many such nights. "You are not gone," she said finally. "So live. Make it mean something." Those words struck him deeply. He turned his head slightly to look at her. She was gathering her things, tying her pouch back to her belt. Her face was peaceful, almost distant. She had done her part and she expected nothing in return. "Will I see you again?" he asked softly. She gave the smallest of shrugs. "The land is wide. Maybe yes, maybe no. But this," she said, pointing lightly at his bandaged shoulder. "You will remember." He nodded slowly. He would remember. He would remember the rifle shot, the cold ground, the moment when death felt close. But most of all, he would remember her sitting beside a small fire in the middle of the canyon, whispering to him to stay. She stood then, straightening her shawl. The morning light caught her hair, making it shine like black river water. Samuel watched as she checked the horizon with the careful eyes of someone used to reading the land. Before she turned to go, she looked at him one last time. "When the night comes again," she said softly, "do not fear it. You have already walked with it once and came back." His throat tightened with something he didn't know how to name. He wanted to say more, to find words big enough to hold everything he felt. But none came, so he simply said, "Thank you, Aylin." She gave a short nod, the kind that carried quiet strength. Then she began to walk toward the ridge, moving like she belonged to the earth itself. Samuel sat there long after she disappeared behind the rocks, listening to the wind. The world felt different now. Not because the land had changed, but because something inside him had. He understood the weight of a life saved. He understood the quiet power of kindness that expected nothing back. He looked down at the bandage on his shoulder and touched it gently. It wasn't just herbs and cloth. It was the memory of a night he would never forget. A night when a stranger knelt beside him and kept death away with steady hands and soft words. Samuel took a long, slow breath. He knew the road to healing would be hard, but he also knew he had been given a gift. A second chance, and that kind of gift was not something a man wasted. As the sun rose higher, warming the canyon, he whispered to himself, "I'll make it mean something." And from somewhere far beyond the ridge, the wind carried a soft sound, a reminder that though Aylin had walked away, the night they shared would remain with him for the rest of his life.